We'll do a very brief kind of recap just to get us back on that same page, and then we'll dive into a lot of poems. We got lots of poems lined up for today, so we'll spend most of our time on those poems. And we'll end, just a little teaser, we'll end with Mary herself. I've queued up a video of Mary reading one of her poems, so we'll end with her. All right, so there she is again, someone we are getting to know more and more. So again, we'll just kind of lickety split through this recap, and we'll take it a little bit farther than we did last time. So we remember for Oliver, both reading poetry and writing poetry is a method for attention and investigation in our backyard, helping us to perceive and recognize the world as a kind of poem, or as a cosmos, a beautiful arrangement. For her, her little microcosm was, of course, the Cape, and in particular, province lands. So in Blackwater Pond, we'll touch on Blackwater Pond again today in one of the poems we'll read. She walked around that trail, Beech Forest Trail, and that was her microcosmic connection to the macrocosm, to the cosmos, the poetic world all around us. Last week, we did a kind of deeper dive into the theme of paying attention, but we remember that she had these three pieces of advice for us, that yes, we want to pay attention, but we also want to be astonished and tell about it. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about those second two. We remember last time we talked about paying attention, that Molly, for Mary Oliver, Molly taught her what attention is really all about. She says it's an openness and an empathy, that really you need to pay attention with empathy if that attention is going to matter and be more than simply a report, she says. This deeper level of looking and working is a way of seeing through the heavenly visibles to the heavenly invisibles. So that's what we touched on last week. She contrasts this, it's just worth kind of underlining, this way of seeing through the heavenly visibles to the heavenly invisibles. She contrasts that against what she calls being filled with a sense of my own thoughts and my own presence. So it's not that she erases herself, but she does find a kind of perspective and proportion where her ego has a place in the family of things, as she puts it, but it is a place among many others in that family. So we can be too full of our own thoughts, too full of our own presences, and she sees poetry and paying attention as a way to let go of some of that egocentrism and see the world outside us, the heaven outside us, the heavenly invisibles and the heavenly visibles. So now let's talk about astonishment just briefly. Astonishment's kind of a neat word. It comes, the roots of the word come from Latin, the Latin for out and the Latin for thunder, or the action of thunder. So astonishment, we could gloss or define as to leave someone thunderstruck, or that when we are astonished, we are thunderstruck. That's a kind of history that's hidden even in the word itself. So we remember her poem Sometimes that we began with 2 weeks ago now, the thunder without a drowsy bone in its body. You may remember that line. So this idea of thunder is something that is itself awake and that also awakens. So for her, astonishment is a form of waking up. So how do we get this astonishment, according to Oliver, as we can kind of discern or draw out of her work? The first thing, the thing she really emphasizes is careful, patient observation and insight. She uses the term investigation. We heard that in her interview with Coleman Barks. So investigation, where we invest, right? The word invest is right there in the word investigation. We invest in our backyards, we invest in our surroundings, and we get dividends. We find things, we find treasures. Over and over the same place. So she, given the opportunity to go to Yosemite or Alaska, she says, I want to walk around Beech Forest one more time, because we can see things when we go back to a place over and over. We can be astonished in a different way because we can see the changes in the flow And, you know, we're living through one right now. We're about to move into spring. I always feel like I miss spring in a way because all of a sudden it's here. So here it comes, the vernal window. You guys probably know what that is, but the vernal window is when branches are starting to show color. Or like forsythia, it hasn't bloomed yet, but the branches of forsythia are starting to yellow. So if you look for those changes, you can be astonished by the activity in these plants, even on a cold day like this. And then a big theme in her work in particular, for example, in the poem Sometimes, but also in many other poems, getting out into it, getting out into the world, getting out into the storm, this theme of immersive experience. So that's really a source of astonishment for Oliver. So yeah, we're careful, we're patient, we're investigating, but we're also getting out in the mix. We're experiencing things immersively through all of our senses. All right, so paying attention toward that kind of astonishment, and then finally, telling about it. So what does she mean by that? There is this little remark she makes later in that same interview with Coleman Barks, where she puts it this way. She says, "One thing I do know is that poetry, to be understood, must be clear. It mustn't be fancy. I have the feeling that a lot of poets writing now they sort of tap dance through it. I always feel that whatever isn't necessary shouldn't be in a poem." So a couple of you guys last week pointed out the simplicity and the clarity of her writing. And I think that's really, for her, essential. She's arguing both through her explanation or commentary on her own work, but also through the work itself, that the writing she's talking about, or the speaking about the experiences we're having, the use of language, it needs to be clear and stripped back, not fancy, not sort of showing off, not tap dancing, although tap dancing can be great too, of course. But in this case, she's looking for simplicity, a dance perhaps, but a kind of simple and bold and clear dance that is accessible to as many people as possible. That's what she has in mind when she says, tell about it. All right, that is our brief presentation for today. We're going to get into the poetry now, see how she's telling about it, and pay attention, of course, to the ways in which she is being astonished and encouraging us to be astonished. So this is a poem we didn't get to last time, so we're going to pick it up, and it's called Song for Autumn. So appropriately enough, here we are on the verge of spring, and we'll be imagining autumn with Mary Oliver. So who among us can start us off by reading this poem? It's on a couple of screens, so it's a medium-sized poem. Who can read it for us? Who's in the autumn mood?
I'll go ahead.
Oh, great. Go ahead, Randy.
Oh, did somebody else just say? Okay. Song for Autumn. Don't you imagine the leaves dream now how comfortable it will be to touch the earth instead of the nothingness of the air and the endless freshets of wind? And don't you think the trees, especially those with mossy hollows, are beginning to look for the birds that will come, 6, a dozen, to sleep inside their bodies? And don't you hear the goldenrod whispering goodbye, the everlasting being crowned with the first tuffets of snow? The pond stiffens and the white field over which the fox runs so quickly brings out its long blue shadows. The wind wags its many tails, and in the evening, the piled firewood shifts a little, longing to be on its way.
Thank you. Beautiful reading. All right, we know the drill. We're going to think about what we notice first. So what did you notice in this poem? What stands out?
First half is questions. Second half are sort of declarations, looks like.
Mm-hmm. No, that's good. Starts with questions, ends with declarations. Nice.
I love the description of the pond stiffens.
Yeah. What do you like about it? What made you respond to that?
I can feel myself stiffening as I sit here. The pond stiffens. I picture water turning to ice
Yeah.
and just kind of bringing my arms in closer to my body
Mhm.
as I read that.
Yeah. Others?
I don't know that I'd say that anthropomorphizing is the right word, but she imputes a lot of feelings to inanimate objects, like leaves are dreaming and have comfort. The trees, are looking for things. They have a desire for birds to come in their body.
Yes.
I think I love the anticipation of everything. The things to come, the
Hmm.
long blue shadows, the firewood shifts a little longing to be on its way. Those are just nice images of anticipation.
Yeah, that's a good observation. A lot of the things that are happening in the poem that these beings are feeling or thinking have to do with what's coming or what's about to happen. That's good. It's the tree is beginning to look for the birds or the
wonder
fire.
if people,
Yeah,
oh,
go
go.
ahead.
I
ahead.
wonder if people in the South read it with the same recognition and feeling as we in New England do. It's so familiar to us.
Mhm.
It's easy to almost be there with her as she describes autumn.
Yeah.
And you wonder if people who don't have white fields and so forth, and
Blue
I don't know,
shadows.
yeah.
Yeah. That's a good question.
I noticed that all of it up till the last sentence is about the natural world. And then she brings in about piled firewood, which seems to be just a touching down of the human world.
Yes. I'm always struck by that last line that it seems out of whack somehow that firewood would be longing. She's challenging me there. I've never thought of firewood longing, but ever since this poem, of course, I do think of firewood longing, or it's an invitation to think of it that way.
What's so odd is it's longing for its own destruction.
Right.
It's sort of like you're going off to a funeral pyre. And then maybe that underlines everything about autumn, that we're entering a season of death in some
Yes.
way. But
Transition, death. Yeah, that's good. Other thoughts or questions or beginning to interpret? Now, I think we're starting already to lean into interpretation. That last comment was very suggestive about what Mary Oliver might be up to here. What do you think?
Well, I was just going to say, I started on mute, that most of this poem feels quite playful and young to me. Like this is the way a child could look at. We're talking about wagging and whispering and dreaming, and those are very innocent kinds of ways of perception, and it feels like. But longing is a different thing. Longing feels more grown up somehow. And just that phrase, to be on its way. I don't know. Yeah, there is definitely a shift in mood there too, for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and a shift in time. I just noticed it's in the evening.
It's in the evening, yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's the end. Autumn feels like an evening in a way. What do you think Mary is trying to come across or get across to us?
Possibly that life changes,
Mhm.
the leaves fall, whereas all summer all spring and summer, they've been up there on their branches.
Yes.
And then eventually they drop down and they're comfortable to be on the earth. The nothingness of the air, endless freshets of wind have changed, and now they just settle. The mossy hollows.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To me, there's sort of a weird way that she's imagining almost this natural world in service to herself. Like she imputes almost all these human feelings to it, like the leaves, and that's just driven home for me in that last line where the role of the firewood is to keep her warm. You know, it's really not necessarily natural.
Mm-hmm.
It's in service of her humanness, you know, and it feels like she's almost describing all of nature in very human-like terms. Like it's almost there, maybe not to serve her, but to, I don't know what, meet her as a person,
Mm-hmm.
instead of her looking at it as something different from herself.
No, that's interesting. Randy, were you saying something on mute?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, well, it reminds me a little bit of that often quoted section of Ecclesiastics. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. You know, it's that particularly around that last line is that each of these elements of nature have a purpose and also a connection. I think she's definitely talking about connections here, even if the connection is only a shadow, like the snow provides a shadow for the fox, or the tree provides a bird, you know, a home for the birds. And even the goldenrod, even as it's saying goodbye, provides a place for the snow to land, you know. It's something about the interconnection of all these elements,
Yeah.
including then sort of more subtly the end of our human connection to those same elements in terms of the wood. I mean, she doesn't say, but she calls it firewood. She doesn't just, you know, say it's wood.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, those last two comments about what we might call anthropomorphizing and then this idea of connection, I think we could put those together, that she is talking about a network of connections like an ecosystem, but she's very interested in investing those connections with much more than a merely, you know, molecular chemical reaction sort of level of connecting. She wants it to be longing and whispering and wishing and dreaming, you know? And so she's saying, why should we limit those things to humans? I think that's part of her argument here. At least that's how I read it, that, you know, one way of looking at the world is we're the only ones who long and wish and all that. And she says, oh, that's nonsense. Of course, trees are looking for the birds, you know? Or another way to, a little spin on that is, does she or doesn't she, right? Because she's asking questions. You know, she begins with this, don't you imagine, right? So it's a little bit different than an argument. She's saying, you know, I have a report for you now, and that is that the trees are dreaming about how comfortable it will be to touch the earth, you know, or that the leaves are dreaming. She's not saying that. She's saying, don't you imagine? And don't you think the trees? So it's this kind of inviting you in. I mean, for me, this is a great example of what she means by attention with empathy. That is a kind of imaginative, playful, childlike willingness to question the idea that these so quote unquote human things to do are only human. You know, why not? I mean, surely trees have something like, you know, our senses. They don't have eyes, but trees move and react, and who are we to limit in that way? And so she's sort of investing her whole environment with these human feelings, or just with these feelings. We don't have to call them human feelings, just with feelings. What do you guys think of that?
I think there's something also about acceptance.
Mm,
These trees accept that the leaves will fall eventually. There's an acceptance that the birds will come. The goldenrod is already whispering goodbye. They're anticipating the sort of the cycle. So there's something about anticipation, and in the end, and the firewood is piled up for what's coming.
that's good. Being willing to play the role, whatever the role is, they've embraced it.
Mm.
You know, we didn't say anything about the title, I just realized. The fact that it's called a song
Yeah.
is kind of interesting too.
What do you
Um,
make of that?
Well, I think about it sort of in the same way that I think about psalms, which are also songs. There's something celebratory about that word, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something you sing. You know, that the elements of nature are singing, even though they're singing their demise in a certain way,
Yeah.
but they're singing it, perhaps because they know they're going to come again. You know, this is a coming and a going. And this is a departure, but it's maybe for nature, it's a rest, you know, it's a resting time.
It's also interesting, she doesn't say song to autumn, but it's a song for autumn. So it's like this is an offering to autumn.
Yeah. Yeah, what a great exercise to think about. What if this were put to music and you heard it sung? You know, what difference would that make? I think it would make a difference. You know, there's a playfulness that come, at least from certain kinds of songs. You know, it would depend on the composer and how, you know, the tone and the performance, but there is, I think, a different register of meaning and possibility when something's being sung to us. That's why it feels so weird when you hear a song you love and then you look at the lyrics just on the page and you read them without singing them. You know, it feels so odd. You know, it's like a totally different kind of language event when you read, you know, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. You know, it's just totally different than when you are singing it. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. The music brings a whole level that is missing otherwise. So I think some composer should take this and run with it.
Well, I think what made me think about a song is because it's suddenly a song about autumn came into my head. It's around, so I can't sing it as around, but it's autumn time, red leaves fall while the weeping sky looks over all. Demeter walks the land, the dying grass is in her hand. Those are the words to the song. But it was sort of in my head, and you're right. It's very different when you sing it. Mhm.
Might accentuate the acceptance part of the poem because a song, depending again on the setting, but the song might bring across a celebration, and that would help lift up this overall theme of all of these things that are happening. There are some departures here, death, going away, transitions, but there's no kind of sorrow for that. There's no second guessing of that. So, you know, let's move on, but this is a nice, for me, a nice example of what Oliver means by empathy, you know, to kind of see and feel with imagination. Or last time when we talked about the breakage, that seeing the story in each fragment of shell, you know, in order to see a story in a shell, you need a lot of imagination, a lot of empathy, a lot of kind of adventurous thinking to be able to see the world and see all the stories in it and all the connections that have emotion in it. You know, why limit emotions to the human being? This is a trend, by the way, in a lot of biology, that there was a strong reaction against anthropomorphism in biology that characterized a lot of the 20th century. But lately, a lot of biologists and people who study animals have said, you know, we don't want to go overboard with that. We don't want to say we are the only ones who have feelings and emotions, and that as a matter of fact, we are part of nature, and so it's reasonable to think about other beings having feelings. Well, one of the people pushing this argument is Cy Montgomery, who's a great writer who just lives here in Hancock. All right, so we've got lots more poems here. So here's one that's on one screen, a lovely poem, Sleeping in the Forest, from relatively early in Oliver's career. So who wants to read this one? If you're wondering if it's you, the answer is yes. Who wouldn't want to sleep in the forest? Go for it.
Sleeping in the forest. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets full of lichens and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed. Nothing between me and the white fire of the stars but my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night, I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night, I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with the luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better.
Thank you. All right, what lifts off the page or off the screen for you on this poem? What'd you notice?
I
A
love
lot of first person. I thought, I heard, I rose and fell.
Aha, yes. I.
The structure leaps out at me. I probably also would have read it the way Carol did, but in fact, she's arranging these lines in ways that would suggest a different kind of rhythm of reading. And that's, it kind of intrigues me.
Mhm.
So it's sort of the shape, the overall shape of that poem. It's kind of an
Right. Yeah,
interesting
she
one.
decided to center it, and yeah.
Mhm.
Other noticings?
I think one thing I noticed immediately is luminous doom, because it seems like it's just such a contrast to the rest of the poem,
Mm-hmm.
because she's talking about nature and beauty and how it enfolds her. And then she's like, oh, doom.
Right.
And I was like, wait a minute, doom?
Yeah.
And then she talks about how she changes. And so maybe the doom isn't really a bad thing, but it's the doom of something worse for something better.
Yeah, that's good. Others?
I think the beginning, so Earth is, anthropomorphized there, right? I mean, it's like Earth is a woman.
Yep.
So that stood out. And I think also that down there with the luminous doom, but the all night I rose and fell is very powerful to me, because it's, there's just like movement in those words, you really like the breath, I guess, or someone breathing.
Right.
It's just very alive.
Yeah. I feel, at least for me, sleeping is like that. I feel recognition there. You kind of rise and then you fall, and then you rise and then you fall. You're turning over. I imagine if I'm in the forest and I'm turning over and I see the trees, and then I go back down. That's what comes to mind for me with that line of rising and falling.
That first bit too is really just almost reminds me of a fairy tale or something. It's like very You know, there's seeds spilling out of the pockets, and it just has like a fably fairy tale feeling that's yeah, it's noticeable,
Yep.
like almost like
like-
yeah.
Go ahead and finish that thought.
No, it's yeah, just it really conjures up an image of, like, you know, straw in your hair, like seeds spilling out, like yeah, fairy tale, fable-y kind of feeling.
Yes.
When I read those first few lines, it makes me think of a chicken when she gathers her brood under her feathers and fluff. I like the words, "She took me back so tenderly," very evocative of a mother in her tenderness.
Mhm.
And I think I mentioned at the beginning, what struck me was this interesting configuration of the lines that doesn't really match what how we might do it in prose. But I just, to myself, I was just reading it, thinking and was sort of stimulated to do that by the words rose and fell.
Mhm.
And if you actually read it the way, kind of in the phrases that it's written, you do get a real rising and falling motion,
Mhm.
which is very different than reading it as if it were kind of normal prose with commas and, you know, periods in all the right places. It's interesting,
Yeah.
but I still don't understand the luminous doom.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to me. She starts two sentences in a row with all night. And
Yeah.
I'm kind of wondering, like, well, which is it? You know, like all night, I heard the small kingdoms breathing, the insects and birds. And then all night, I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. Those sentences
Yeah.
are in tension. You know, I don't, are they inconsistent, or where is she vanishing to? Is it listening what we're familiar with, listening to the natural world and losing herself? Or is it this dream world of luminous doom? It's, yeah, just very ambiguous to me.
Mhm. Yeah, that's good. Any other ideas about the doom? I think that's an interesting place to push a little bit. Because it's a lovely portrait until that word.
Right, but I mean, maybe one clue is just, I mean, so, but the two words taken together are like really opposite. I mean, luminous has really good connotations.
Yes.
And so they're beautiful to get, I mean, wow, you know, but I'm just saying that could point, we've got to consider that it's not just doom, it's luminous doom.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about a sleep is a little death that you rise and fall into. And I also just love how luminous and doom both have the ooh sound in them.
Yeah.
They just fit so perfectly together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's as like as though she goes to sleep in the forest, so she's totally immersed in the world of nature,
Yes.
and that it's perfect and the animals are breathing, all's well. And then she describes in the beginning how she's merged like a stone on the riverbed. There's no space between her and the forest, between her and nature.
Right.
And then she says, I rose and fell as if in water. So she's somehow in a different place. She's floating now. She's not rigid. And during that time, I have a sense that's her sleeping time.
Mhm.
And it's interesting she puts luminous in front of doom. So doom does have this heavy connotation of something, but it's luminous. It's though it's illuminated. So there's something while she's sleeping, whatever's been heavy is illuminated. And then she says, by morning I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. So it's like there's this process during the night of this doom being transformed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Carol's idea of death is interesting to think about, with sleep being like death. That's a very common theme in a lot of culture and poetry and literature. That the day is like a life and the sleep is like a death, and then you wake up again and do it again. I mean, it could be that she's bringing something to it too. It could be that she is struggling with something herself and kind of wrestling through that as she sleeps. But it also could be that the doom is part and parcel. That would be very, very true to a lot of her other poems, that nature is a beautiful thing. There's lovely dark skirts and lots of seeds and lichen, and but there's also, I keep going back to the cat head, but there's also the cat head. Remember the cat head from Sometimes, where there's this sense of, yeah, it's rich, it's luminous, but there's also death, there's violence, there's endings, there's suffering, and all that's in there too, and you can't really separate it out, as many fairy tales explore, right? That the classic form of the fairy tale, you got some doom in there, right? It's not just pretty. Disney might make it pretty, but the classic fairy tales, it's almost dominated by a sense of the doom is there, luminous perhaps, but it's there.
And the word grappling is a strong word. Right before that, she's grappling with a luminous doom.
Yeah.
And way back near the beginning, she talks about the white fire of the stars.
Yeah.
Those are both strong images.
Yeah. That's a good to draw our attention to those phrases. I mean, grappling, that might be Jacob and
Right.
or the divine figure, that story in Genesis about Jacob wrestling with God. Really, it's sometimes called the angel, but if you read the text, it's actually God he's wrestling with, grappling all night.
And that would work with the stone, because Jacob's head was on a stone
That's
in
right
that
too.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an inexhaustible one.
I mean, on some level too, it maybe just can work as, very much in keeping with Mary Oliver, like going into nature, looking for something and ultimately, grappling and then coming out better, or
Right.
being healed in a way,
Yeah. And it's not all easy, but it's a good outcome. Yeah, that's good.
yeah, it's a good outcome.
Yeah. All right, well, let's bear this one in mind as we move on to the next one, which is actually a good one following that one. So it's a few screens, but this one has well, I won't give it away. You guys, who's going to read this one?
I will.
Yes, thank you, Sherry.
I need to find it. Well, because it's cut off, but I don't know how to get the picture, so maybe I need to find it somewhere.
Oh,
Uh,
what do you mean cut off? You mean on the
yeah, I can't see all the words, so
Okay.
okay. So, okay. Not in shyness, but in disgust, the owl turns its face from me and pours itself into the air, hurrying until it is out of sight. And after all, even if we came by some miracle upon a language which we both knew, what is it, I might say, there in the orange light of early morning, in the owl's resting time, that would have any pluck and worth in it? Not admonition or blame, and not recrimination, and not, I say, unholy weeping, and not, for God's sake, any bending of the knees, in the cold and rough grass, under its gold and glassy eyes, which in such a conversation you must imagine turned upon you. So I cannot improve upon the scene. As it happens, my opportunity and my stony silence, as death rises up, God's bark-colored thumb, and opens the sheath of its wings, and turns its hungry hooked head upon me, and away, and softly lamp-eyed becomes the perfect billowing instrument as it glides through the wind like a knife.
Hmm.
That one gives me chills. So we won't spend too much time on it because we've got some great ones to come, but I think it's an interesting poem to follow upon Sleeping in the Forest. What are some things you notice and or questions you have or interpretations you'd bring to it? Oh, you're on mute.
That comment about, I think it's the page before, about she isn't going to bend her knees for God's sake, you know, she's
Yeah.
not going to pray, she's not going to, you know, sing hallelujah here. She's not, this is not a religious moment somehow. It's a moment of an encounter with something difficult, and she's just going to let it be that way. Yeah, she says she's not going to try to improve upon the scene as it is.
Yes. He's going to connect or encounter, not make a bunch out of the encounter or try to elaborate on it or embellish it. She's just going to encounter.
I don't understand why she says weeping, unholy weeping. It's
Yeah.
almost as if saying that there's something bad about weeping. It's something you don't do. And I don't know if it reflects maybe on her growing up years. I don't know if her family was religious, you know, followed a faith and she didn't want any part of that. I don't know if that plays into this poem.
Now it's interesting. She might be saying that weeping is unholy, or she might be saying that there is a thing that she calls unholy weeping. So a type of weeping that is kind of unholy in the, I don't know in what sense she means, of course, but for example, it could be a sort of over dramatic or self-absorbed weeping, as opposed to a more, you know, less self-oriented form of weeping. So it might be that she's distinguishing between types of weeping there.
Okay, I get that.
Or that's just a possibility.
Well,
That's a striking phrase.
the line that really gets me is when she says, I can't improve upon the scene as it happens, my opportunity and my stony silence. As death rises up, God's bark-colored thumb, and opens the sheath of its wings. So it's as if the owl is death itself. So she wants to confront death. Just how? By looking it in the eye, you know, like by weeping or kneeling before it, but to have a similar pride and confidence as death itself has back to her. Spooky poem.
Yeah, that sentiment I think will be good to bear in mind as we get to a poem in a few minutes, which is one of our most famous, called When Death Comes. But yeah, this is surely a personification or owlification of death, and it's a really arresting one.
Yeah.
Billowing instrument gliding through the wind like a knife. Whew. Now there's a brutality to nature that she doesn't want to kind of, you know, poeticize away. She wants to go right into that cave, the luminous doom of the owl.
It's great because even the title of the poem is so mysterious. This morning again, it was in the dusty pines. Like what it it wasn't like the owl was in the dusty pines. It's this
Definitely.
metaphoric thing.
Yeah, and that word again, it creates a whole kind of mystery again. So this is one of several incidents or something, It's good. All right, well, not to denigrate this poem at all, but for the sake of the others, we're going to move on. There was a request to think a little bit about how Oliver was influenced by religion in general, and also non-Christian religions in particular. There's a poem which I recommend to you, which we won't look at today together, but you can look at it if you're interested in how Buddhism figures in her thought, called The Buddha's Last Instruction. That's one of her kind of famous poems where Buddha plays a role, and it's a great poem. This is another one, not so much Buddhism, but Hinduism. As you know, Buddhism kind of is a spin-off from Hinduism. And this is very different than almost any other poem we've read so far. But it has some nice resonances. So it's a two-screen poem. So who would like to read Varanasi?
I'd be glad to read it if no one's going to volunteer.
Great, go ahead, Randy.
All right. I just want to check on the pronunciation. G-H-A-T is Ghat.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, where, oh, yeah, Ghat, yeah, Ghat.
Ghat, yeah. Early in the morning, we crossed the Ghat, where fires were still smoldering, and gazed with our Western minds into the Ganges. A woman was standing in the river up to her waist. She was lifting handfuls of water and spilling it over her body slowly and many times, as if until there came some moment of inner satisfaction between her own life and the river's. Then she dipped a vessel she had brought with her and carried it filled with water back across the Ghat, no doubt to refresh some shrine near where she lives. For this is the holy city of Shiva, maker of the world, and this is his river. I can't say much more, except that it all happened in silence and peaceful simplicity, and something that felt like that bliss of a certainty and a life lived in accordance with that certainty. I must remember this, I thought, as we fly back to America. Pray God, I remember this.
So again, we'll just take a little bit of time with this one because we want to get to when death comes. We want to get to death, right? But let's kind of phrase it this way. It's a little bit different approach. You could say, wow, this poem is so different than all the others, but what are some ways that you see or resonances that you hear with what we've looked at so far with this poem, which could be superficially read as an entirely different kind of thing? What are some similarities or resonances that you pick up?
I see the connection between the night in the forest and the rhythmic way that those lines read, and her scooping, well, there was another poem, Cupping Your Hands in the Water at Blackwood Pond.
Yes.
But the water figures so significantly in her poetry, and it's quite sensual when she is lifting the handfuls of water, spilling it over her body. It's rhythmic and slow and quite beautiful.
Yes.
It also is interesting that God is capitalized in this poem and not in the others.
Yeah, sometimes she does, sometimes she doesn't. That's interesting throughout her work. One line for me that is illuminating or revealing, or at least I think so, is this line of inner satisfaction between her own life and the river's. That This is something she's noticing about another woman, but I can't help but feel it's something that she, Mary Oliver, is longing for. That is, or that, or even working toward, or hoping that she can maintain and develop. That is an inner satisfaction between her life and the life of Blackwater Pond, or the life of Beech Forest, or which involves, again, her imaginative empathy that she could even think that a river or a forest or a pond could have satisfaction. But that's the kind of connection that she sees. She sees not just a kind of ecological connection, she sees a emotional connection between her life and the life of, say, a river.
I actually was struck by those two lines for a different reason. Those two words, as if. I think in the previous poems, I mean, here she's actually interpreting something, taking her hand and interpreting in a way I don't remember hearing it quite that way before. It's not just observation, the woman standing in the river and handfuls of water and all of that, that's observation. But now that as if,
right.
I sort of feel, yeah, some drawing back, and maybe because she is thinking about herself there in a way that I don't quite remember her doing in the previous poems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a little more distance.
A little more distance, exactly. Yeah.
Might be because of, as she signals, that she's looking with her Western mind, and she might feel that distance. And that's interesting. All right, any other thoughts on this before we go to death? Before we die? Last wills and testaments?
I like just the last thing, that the other line I liked is, I can't say much more. Then she does go on to say a little bit, but it is like she's losing her Western mind. Before, it's always been the language that's the third step that you put up earlier that's essential to be able to talk about it. And here she's saying, no, this is different. I can't talk about it.
Yeah, that's good. All right, great. Well, another thing that's hard to talk about is, of course, death. You guys, I recommend this one to you, In Blackwater Woods. It's a beautiful poem. You may know it. It's a good one to come back to. And these last lines are very famous. We'll just touch on them here. It says, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. So that is a very famous ending of this well-known poem that brings us, of course, back to Blackwater Woods. All right, When Death Comes. So I know someone's been just waiting to read this one, so don't be shy, or else we're going to have Randy read it again. Go for it. Who wants to read it?
Somebody else?
Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, okay. When death comes. When death comes like the hungry bear in autumn, when death comes and takes all the bright coins from his purse to buy me and snaps the purse shut, when death comes like the measles pox, when death comes like an iceberg between the shoulder blades, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering, what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness? And therefore I look upon everything as a brotherhood and a sisterhood, and I look upon time as no more than an idea, and I consider eternity as another possibility. And I think of each life as a flower, as common as a field daisy, and as singular, and each name a comfortable music in the mouth, tending as all music does toward silence, and each body a lion of courage, and something precious to the earth. When it's over, I want to say all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. When it's over, I don't want to wonder if I have made of my life something particular and real. I don't want to find myself sighing and frightened or full of argument. I don't want to end up simply having visited this world.
Very good. A classic. What do you guys see here? so poignant to read a poem about death by a poet who's just recently died.
Well, one thing I have to say is that the poem before this, I think, was 2012. So this was written quite a while before. And it's interesting because I think somebody was talking about how she didn't want to talk too much or say too much. And yet this poem is much more like prescriptive, you know? So it's like interesting. It's like a younger, maybe like a younger person approaching this. And I'm just noticing that, I guess. You know, I wonder how the older Mary Oliver would react to this, I guess. I wonder. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. Other thoughts?
How old was she when she wrote this question? Yeah.
Yeah, let's see. What is her birth date? I think it's, so she dies in 2019. She's in her early 80s, so this is roughly in her 50s.
50s, yeah.
I was thinking, you know, if you go back to the first poem that we looked at today,
Yeah,
and the firewood is kind of eager to go on to the next part of its transformation,
yes.
that sort of echoes that when she says, let's see, I want to step through the door full of curiosity, wondering what is it going to be like, that cottage of darkness, you know, and
Yeah, that's good. You get the sense she's constantly stepping through doors full of curiosity, that was a really big part of who she was. And who she hopes for us to be too.
And I think she didn't want to come to the end of her life and have regrets.
Yeah. Yeah.
She wanted her life to matter. And I think through all her poetry, she certainly embodied that she did matter.
Yeah, in that regard, this phrase, a bride married to amazement, is I think if you had to boil down into, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words, what her project was, that's pretty good. Taking the world into her arms in that next line, that, at least for me, makes me think of Edna St. Vincent Millay. Remember Edna St. Vincent Millay's poem that we looked at last week about wanting to hold the world close? Any final thoughts before we go to Mary herself and have her finish off the course with a poem?
It's such a different mood from the owl poem, like the morning again, it was in the dusty pine. She was so defiant in the face of death, proud and confident. And it's almost just more looking at life, I guess, than death, and when death comes, but it's a very different mood. They were written around the same period also.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. This one is very much oriented toward what she wants her life to have been at the death point. Yeah, that's good. It's a different vantage or different angle. She doesn't want us to simply visit. She wants us to be there and live there. So with that in mind, one of the great things about Mary Oliver, there's so many, but she had all these wonderful dog poems. So she has actually a book of dog poems. She had many dog companions. And so we're going to end with one of those poems. She calls them Percy poems. One of her dogs was named Percy, but she has many dogs and many poems about them. But it's a nice, you'll see it's a nice note to end on. It's a poem she used to end her readings with. So not to be missed. Here we go. So Mary will finish us off here, so to speak.
And I'm going to conclude, of course, with one more little Percy poem. It's called Little Dog's Rhapsody in the Night. I've got a lot of these poems. He puts his cheek against mine and makes small, expressive sounds. And when I'm awake or awake enough, he turns upside down, his 4 paws in the air, and his eyes dark and fervent. Tell me you love me, he says. Tell me again. Could there be a sweeter arrangement? Over and over, he gets to ask it, I get to tell. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, deafening applause there.
Brattleboro Norberts Ace, your Vermont family-owned hardware store, has been proudly serving Brattleboro and its surrounding community.
There you go. All right. So that's Mary ending our course the way she used to end at least some of her readings. Thank you all for participating. You guys are awesome readers, and I've done a lot of work with students or people in seminars, as you can imagine, and it's not always that you get great chemistry in the group. So thank you all so much for your contributions to that. It really makes a huge difference, the kinds of things you guys brought to it. So thanks for taking the plunge and being a part of it. And thanks to Miles and to Susie and to the Harris Center. And I hope you continue to have a wonderful day. So thank you very much. We can wave to each other.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
I'll be sending the recording out.
Great. Thanks, Miles.
Bye. Thanks, Matt.